Welcome to the China Global Podcast. I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We're going to talk today about China's relationships with Southeast Asian countries. China's ties with Southeast Asian states are increasingly consequential for regional stability and global geopolitics. Over the past 2 decades, China has become the region's largest trading partner and a major source of investment and infrastructure financing in the region. At the same time, China's growing military presence and its aggressive behavior in the South China Sea have caused anxiety and prompted a number of Southeast Asian nations to seek closer security ties with the United States and other partners. The Trump administration's policies of imposing tariffs, reducing foreign assistance, and implementing stricter immigration regulations have begun to erode U.S. influence across the regions, further encouraging Southeast Asian countries to rely more on each other and to diversify their relationships with external partners. To discuss Beijing's evolving approach to Southeast Asia and the efficacy of its policies, I'm delighted to have as my guest today, Dr. Chong Ian. He's an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore and a non-resident fellow at Carnegie, China. Ian's research focuses on Chinese politics, foreign policy, and U.S.-China relations, and of course, Southeast Asia. Thanks so much for joining us today, Ian.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
So let's start by sort of zooming out. How would you describe China's overall strategy toward Southeast Asia? What are Beijing's objectives and what are the tools that it's using to achieve them?
So I think the sort of overall objective that Beijing wants with Southeast Asia is to have a region that doesn't create problems for it, that is relatively pliant to its demands, and really goes along and perhaps even supports some of its positions, such as on Taiwan or even the South China Sea with some countries. How it goes about trying to achieve these ends, one, it's trying to use a lot of enticement economically, especially. And on the other, the region, the sort of premier regional organization, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, also known as ASEAN, has historically sometimes created some roadblocks for the PRC. So I think the PRC is trying to create more divisions within ASEAN because their organization works on consensus. So without that consensus, they can't really move forward, even on things that it may want to raise with Beijing.
You specifically mentioned some of the economic measures that China is using. So is China using both positive inducements and economic coercion and pressure? Does it try to strike a balance between the two? I assume that depends on the target state.
So what I find is really fascinating about the PRC's relations with Southeast Asia economically is that it has managed to create this sense that Southeast Asia really needs China for its economic progress and growth, when the numbers don't actually show that up. But it's a really pervasive belief. So if you look at foreign direct investment, for instance, the PRC ranks maybe third or fourth, behind the US, behind the EU, a little bit behind Japan, and maybe a little bit ahead of South Korea, right? But the impression is that PRC investment FDI is, really driving a lot of growth. That's actually not true. If you look at the trade aspect, the trade in merchandise, trade in goods, clearly the PRC is the largest player by value. It doesn't outstrip Southeast Asia's trade with each other, but by value, certainly the PRC is head and shoulders above everyone else. However, Southeast Asia has a chronic trade deficit with the PRC. So it actually loses money, in trade with the PRC. That's actually okay because it has a trade surplus with Europe, with the United States and elsewhere. So the region depends on this circulation, but it believes that the trade is so important it cannot let go. And so what Beijing really doesn't have to do is to engage in any real punishment. It signals to the punishment it has unleashed before on South Korea, on Australia, and the Philippines. I think the Philippines is the one that really stands out as a country that has, experienced direct PRC pressure. But all these are provide demonstrative effects. So a lot of the other states in Southeast Asia are really afraid that Beijing would punish them, even though they've not actually felt any of this. So they often preemptively comply with what they think are Beijing's interests. Of course, there's variation across the region. States like Laos and Cambodia are far more embedded. But even then, there are questions about the equitability of Beijing's investment and trade. There are questions about environmental damage that also come up, but tend to be more suppressed by the official press in these places.
So basically, China's strategy of killing the chicken to scare the monkey is having some positive impact.
Oh, yeah, it has, I think, in Southeast Asia, quite a fair bit of traction, perhaps more than in other places.
So then how would you assess like the overall efficacy of China's Southeast Asia strategy under Xi Jinping? And is it doing anything new that it wasn't doing previously? And where is Beijing succeeding? Where is it falling short?
So I think where Beijing has succeeded is to get a lot of silence, to buy a lot of silence from much of Southeast Asia, with the notable exception of the Philippines. Philippines, I think, is in a very different position where it has far more direct areas of contention. But the rest of Southeast Asia is willing to be quiet. Sometimes in semi-official events, you even hear the blaming of the Philippines for ostensibly provoking Beijing, even though I think that's far more debatable than is actually the case. So that aside, I think where Xi Jinping, under Xi Jinping, the PRC might not, be getting as much as it would want is in terms actually on the economic front. So in recent years, there's been a lot of stress in a lot of Southeast Asia, in part because of the imports that they get from the PRC. That is putting a lot of pressure on small and medium-sized enterprises on manufacturing. So that's creating a degree of pushback. That it may not float up to the sort of big official levels, but it creates friction, right, in the PRC's effort to win over these countries. Where I think the PRC has some success is in terms of having businesses that have a lot of PRC-linked interests, and to get them to sort of push the PRC's line in Southeast Asia. That's where I think it's got a lot of traction. So in all, I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but that silence, I think, is important. Winning that silence is important.
What about media, and how does China use regional media, and of course, particularly in Southeast Asian countries where there's a lot of Chinese diaspora? How do they use that to promote China's influence?
So there's several things going on. This is a great question but bear with me, it gets a little bit complicated. So there is the Mandarin language media, and there's the non-Mandarin language media, and they're used in different ways. The Mandarin language media is used to push this sort of diasporic nationalism that the PRC has under Xi Jinping really refreshed and sort of recharged, that had been put aside, previously. Essentially after Mao, they put that aside a little bit. But with Xi, his sort of idea of sons and daughters of China, broadly defined, 中华儿女, that sort of push, it's reinvigorated this effort to win over the, I guess, for lack of a better term, diaspora. I mean, there would be people who are ethnic Chinese descent who see themselves as ethnic Chinese, but not as diaspora. They believe they belong in Southeast Asia. So, anyways, there's contestation over that, and to get these people to sometimes push Beijing's line. That's one thing that happens. Another is that for ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia who buy Beijing's line and then amplify this view elsewhere, in third countries and so on, that helps Beijing create credibility in terms of its narratives. So that's one aspect where the PRC's efforts to sort of push their own media out, to have a lot of media collaboration with Mandarin language media, has a degree of traction. Then there's the non-Mandarin language stuff. So this could be in English language, it could be in various Southeast Asian languages. So there, what we see is an effort to provide media training. There's an effort to push Xinhua wires for cheap or for free to these places. So you could pay for, say, a Reuters or an AP wire, but Xinhua comes along and says, "Well, take this for free. I'll take it for much cheaper," and you get the PRC narrative being sold through in these sort of vernaculars. Then the sort of media space there, they of course start reflecting the PRC position a little bit more. And you have individuals who might be quite happy to sort of take the PRC line. So that's the traditional media space, both print and broadcast. Then they're the influencers, which Beijing sometimes will take to have these tours in Xinjiang and so on, and essentially show them a really good time, have them put out content that really tries to reinforce Beijing's line about, their treatment of Tibetans or people in Xinjiang or on Hong Kong and Taiwan and so on and so forth. And they become a sort of another vector, right, that pushes out the Beijing's line. Then there are questions about Beijing using proxies sometimes, online troll farms, these media outlets. This, in fact, Reuters just today had a piece on it in the Philippines. So that's another sort of vector. So in many respects, Beijing looking at Southeast Asia as a region where perhaps it believes that, its prominence has to be really established is, pretty full spectrum in the way that it's trying to use different media channels to advance its position.
Wow, that's really interesting. And of course, we see this globally, not only in Southeast Asia. Obviously, the views that Southeast Asian countries have of China varies considerably across all of the 10 states. But do you see any areas of consensus? Are there any new trends where you see maybe the gap narrowing, or is it widening? And then, of course, another important related question is, how do the views of elites differ from public perceptions?
Right. So those are really sort of big and meaty issues to get into. So in terms of where there's, I guess, consensus is overall, there is a view that Beijing is really important, if not crucial, for the region's economies going forward. Now, this is again quite curious because there is a discounting of the slow growth in the PRC and the demographic decline that the PRC is also facing. So that gets written off, and that's quite consistent, I think, across the region. I think where you see some divergence is when you have a lot of contact with the PRC through business or through tourists. Sometimes there are questions of over-tourism. We saw that in Thailand before. We see when PRC investment sometimes gets into issues of environmental damage, get into issues of the sort of equitable distribution of wealth and labor, and as I mentioned earlier, putting pressure on small and medium-sized enterprises in places like Indonesia, in sort of pockets of Malaysia. You get some pushback, right? But this brings us very nicely to that elite public, I guess, division even. So there are a couple of indicators that are useful to look at. So the Yusof Ishak Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore puts out this yearly State of Southeast Asia survey. People sort of have lots of quibbles about how the methodology is done, but essentially it's an elite survey, and what it consistently shows is that generally speaking, there is a lot more skepticism among elites towards the PRC. How across that, it varies across country, but there's more skepticism. If you compare this against the Pew polls, which is a public opinion poll across countries like Malaysia and Singapore, they haven't done all of Southeast Asia. There's far more sort of belief in and good faith toward the PRC. So there is certainly an elite public divide, and I guess this gets to the different kinds of interactions that people have, and the way that Beijing has really inserted itself in the sort of public media and the public mind. So these areas, of course, create some friction. How that plays out, I think, is pretty interesting to see, especially as Beijing runs into more economic problems. It's not able to pour in as much money in Southeast Asia today as it did maybe 10 years ago at the height of the BRI.
So, Ian, I want to bring in the U.S. factor into our discussion. Obviously, the Trump administration's policies have complicated relations with countries around the world. Uh, do you see countries in Southeast Asia tilting more toward China or trying to diversify their relationships? And is Beijing attempting to exploit new opportunities to enhance its influence?
So let me start with the last bit of your question first. Beijing definitely is trying, when it puts across this messaging that it's for stability, it's for growth, it's for inclusivity. That message is very much targeted towards many parts of the global south, but also towards Southeast Asia, because I think Beijing is mindful of the fact that the unpredictability of the Trump administration, the lack of certainty, creates a lot of anxiety. And to be honest, I think much of Southeast Asia has become very comfortable with a U.S. relationship that is generally for more economic openness, that is pretty predictable and stable. And so, with the Trump administration's approach, there's not that much clarity on what to do. I do have to say that at the outset of the Trump administration, there was a belief that second Trump administration would look very much like the first one. So you just sort of work a lot of the transactions and things will be fine. But the second administration has a lot of differences, and I think Southeast Asian states are still trying to grapple with that. They're still trying to figure out what to do, and there is some gravitation towards Beijing, so that talk about inclusivity and stability is appealing. But I think for Southeast Asia, there is also a desire to look for more diversification, because I think there's also a lot of discomfort with potentially being caught in between the US and the PRC as friction on the two sides increases. You and many of your listeners might have heard this sort of term coming from Southeast Asia about not wanting to choose sides, or wanting to be friends to all and enemies to none. So I think that sort of position, the language is still there, but I think there is a slow, perhaps very slow realization that it's not about what you choose or not. You could be presented with a fait accompli that you don't particularly like, and you have a very little role in trying to shape. And so that sort of effort to search for diversification is an attempt to address some of the potential pitfalls with being presented with a situation you don't like. However, given that the 10, and you include Timor-Leste, 11 Southeast Asian countries are very different, trying to work together has become really, really difficult. So there was a call earlier in the year to sort of talk about, well, maybe we should all bargain collectively with the Trump administration on tariffs. Now there's some talk on, okay, looking at RCEP and things like that, but the degree to which ASEAN is able to pull the Southeast Asian countries together has always been somewhat limited. So personally, I wouldn't be holding my breath on, quick movement there.
How do you think Southeast Asian countries would react if China tried to take Taiwan by force, or in some lesser contingency, maybe started inspecting container ships or implementing a sort of partial blockade? Would they condemn the use of force? Would countries in the region view Taiwan as sort of, sui generis, that it has no implications for China's approach to other countries? Or would a actual kinetic action against Taiwan increase fears that China might one day use military force, maybe in the South China Sea or elsewhere, in ways that could really damage the interests of Southeast Asian nations?
Right. So there is an effort to not think about Taiwan and not think about the implications of any kinetic or more serious gray zone type activity. It's unfortunate, but that's the case, because many would like to think that Taiwan is over there and far away and out of mind. That is the policy response, but unfortunately, I don't think the reality of Taiwan's geography allows for that kind of thinking. If you just look at a map, Taiwan, sits in between Northeast and Southeast Asia. If you wanted to trade with South Korea, Japan, or even ports on the southeast PRC coast. You have to get around Taiwan somehow. Submarine cables run around Taiwan, and it's just north of the Philippines. So any escalation can quickly spread south. And even if it doesn't, it's going to be highly disruptive to a lot of Southeast Asia's trade and, frankly, financial interaction. So the trade obviously goes by ship, some of it by air. It passes these areas. Disruptions will be expensive. To have your commercial information and your financial information sent seamlessly through submarine cables, that's going to be disrupted as well. So unfortunately, I don't think Southeast Asia can escape any major disruption, but there's a belief that someone else will take care of the problem. And this extends not just to the sort of trade and economic stuff. If you look at Taiwan, the official numbers are about 900 plus thousand Southeast Asian citizens. They live and work in Taiwan. Unofficial estimates put it at about 1.5 million people. So what are you going to do about your citizens? Are you going to do some evacuation? Some countries like Indonesia say that they are interested in doing that, but how are they going to evacuate these people? Do they have enough ships? Do they have enough aircraft? I mean, they've got the official numbers for Indonesia. It's about 600,000 citizens in Taiwan. That's a big endeavor. So how they're going to approach this is less clear. The big exception, as I mentioned earlier, is the Philippines. Because, they're just south of Taiwan. They realize that any blow up, any escalation there, it's unlikely that the Philippines will escape it. Hence, they're looking a lot more at deterrence. They're looking at shoring up relations, not just with the United States, but with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, because they realize they can't really escape a contingency. I think the fact that the Philippines has had such a tumultuous relationship with the PRC over the South China Sea, in areas just south of Taiwan, actually, they realize that they probably need to be more prepared. The rest of Southeast Asia, I think, arguably are quite happy to wait for someone to take care of the problem for them. It's not the ideal situation, and I think it probably will this kind of an attitude probably lends itself to a greater likelihood of things going wrong, because no one really wants to think about prevention of crisis. And part of the reason is because of what I had mentioned earlier. There's a real fear that Beijing could punish you. So the less you say, the less you talk about these issues, perhaps the better.
So you noted to me in our email exchanges before we had this conversation that there is this general unwillingness to consider crisis prevention, to think seriously about contingency planning. So you're saying the main reason is because of fear of China. Is there anything that might cause that to change?
So I think if you have some sort of major crisis that doesn't boil over, that might get some thinking done. I think the closest thing we've come to in recent years was Beijing saber rattling after Nancy Pelosi's visit. There you had ASEAN put out this very, I would say, odd statement about worries about crisis across the strait. They didn't even mention which strait it was. You sort of knew if you read down the document, because they talk about each state following their own respective one China policies. So that suggests that the great sense of caution. But I think if there's a realization that there'll be heavy costs, and no one is, the cavalry's not coming. I think the capitals across Southeast Asia may realize that they have to become a lot more serious. But until that point, I think it's just much easier to sort of, believe it's someone else's problem.
So I want to ask you as a final question to look into your crystal ball. How do you expect China-Southeast Asia relations to evolve in the next maybe 5 to 10 years? And what will be the most important determinants of whether China's influence increases or wanes? Is the U.S. factor really important? Is it China's policies? Are there other considerations?
Right. So I think both sides, the different sides, so across Southeast Asia and in the PRC, there are incentives to have good and cooperative relations. But that's complicated by several factors, the US being one of them. But I think first and foremost, it would be the PRC's own domestic economy. Because for right now, a lot of the relationship is predicated on this belief that the PRC presents this sort of the future of economic growth and development. If because of demographic problems, because of the PRC's own issues on shifting towards a more consumption-based economy, if that continues to be a serious problem, then Southeast Asia may have to look for other places to help drive its growth. So that's one thing, and that could create some friction. I think if there's going to be escalation in whether this is the South China Sea around Taiwan, or for that matter, the East China Sea, it will prove highly disruptive for Southeast Asia. That would be something to consider. And for the U.S., I think where the U.S. features is if there's an inability to work with a U.S. that perhaps presents a more predictable course of action. It's really hard to plan if the U.S. keeps changing its position very often. So that might force a deepening of ties with the PRC, but also a further diversification. But I think also there is a realization that the United States is economically very important for Southeast Asia. I mean, the scramble to get into these tariff negotiations with the Trump administration, I think underscores the point that for Southeast Asia, they too realize they can't do without the U.S. And this gets back to the bit that I mentioned earlier. The economies in this region, for right now, unless a new model comes about, only works if you're getting capital from the U.S. and other developed economies that you can use to buy stuff from the PRC that you then, add and you value add and then sell back to the developed economies. So if that sort of market in the U.S. Becomes a lot more diminished, then it will force some sort of rethink in Southeast Asia's relations, not just with the U.S. but also with China. They need to essentially come up with a new business model. What that looks like right now, I don't think anyone has a clue yet.
We've been talking with Dr. Chong. He's an associate professor of political science at the National University of Singapore and a non-resident fellow at Carnegie China. Thanks for joining us, Ian.
Thank you. My pleasure.